Well, we're thankful for the opportunity to meet this morning. I assume everybody got sufficient sleep. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, beginning.
Bill, before you start there, we go back to 6, where we talked last week about the Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not partaking of the food and all that. You wonder, like in our world today, how many others were there that were noblemen's sons and all the others that did do that, that did go along with the custom of the way it was at that point.
Ned is saying that in verse 6, and going back to a spot we were last week, and he's wondering, or he's querying, since Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah did not violate the dietary laws of the law of Moses, Ned is asking the question, or posing maybe the rhetorical question. I wonder how many of their even fellow Jews didn't adhere to the law of Moses. And in fact, that brings up a point. We only have a record of Daniel, and as their names were changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We don't have a record. We only have a record of those Jewish people. Now, were there others in that mix? There could have been. But these are singled out as being true to the law of Moses. Thank you for pointing that out, Ned. Now, we pointed out last week, and we want to get our minds wrapped around this situation, that their names were changed. Hananiah to Shadrach, Mishael to Mishael to Meshach, Azariah to Abednego. Now, Daniel and his companions had names, Jewish names, that related to God, had some meaning that related to God, the God of the Jews, the Jehovah God. And then when their names were changed, then they took on their names took on a meaning, or had the meaning of some of the various gods of the Babylonians. And of course, the Babylonians had a series of gods. I think they had a main god, but they had a series of gods. Scholars indicate that the temple, one of the temples, I think it was to Baal, B-E-L, their god Baal, B-E-L, had just mountains of gold in it. And of course, as Babylon was the ruler of the known world there, of course they could, scarf up all the gold and all the riches from the countries that they attacked and took over and raided. So the Babylonians were very much into their gods. Now, not only did they, we mentioned last week that, and Ned brought it up, Daniel had the courage, and by the way, Daniel wouldn't have been very old at this point in time. Daniel was a prophet in Babylon for 70 years. His tenure as a prophet extended over basically the 70 years that the Jews were in Babylonian captivity, and then his work continued on into the Medo-Persian Empire government, because he served Darius the Mede, and he served, what's his name? Who followed Darius? The dude that let the Jews come back. Cyrus, yeah. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. I think it might be due to sleep deprivation, but at least so Daniel's tenure in a foreign land was like 72, 70, maybe even 75 years. So he wouldn't have been very old when he was brought in there, and his companions weren't very old. And this, he convinced the guy that was in charge. They had a guy there in charge of getting the captives, and they focused on getting royalty into their government. That is, royalty of the nations that they conquered. But there's a dude there that was in charge of getting them indoctrinated into the Babylonian language, the Chaldean language, the diet, the culture, the history. Now, how long was that period of indoctrination? Well, it was 3 years. So apparently, in this narrative, the Babylonian kings got these foreigners that were up and coming, intelligent, good looking, no blemishes. It mentions here they didn't have any blemishes. So they got them situated to be effective in ruling and helping the king, at least advising the king. Now, Daniel only asked for an exception for 10 days on this diet. I wonder what the Babylonian diet was. That's kind of we'll never know, but it certainly didn't match the diet of Moses, the law of Moses. Well, so Daniel says, hey, give us 10 days on our grain, our vegetables and water, and see if we aren't as good as, seeing if we aren't, progressing in terms of looks. I suppose many of these people that came from, that were captured were, come somewhat haggard and, malnourished. And so they needed to get them, nourished. Well, we don't know how but 10 days, that's not very long. They had a 3-year period of training. And as it turns out, either by the providence of God or by what they ate, they were looking pretty good at the end of 10 days. And so this person in charge of training these captives for governmental work or advising the king or something, they were in 10 days. They looked at least convinced that the guy in charge was convinced that, well, this is okay. This foreign diet is okay. So Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went to the Babylonian University there, a 3-year course, and then they graduated from that training and stood before the king. But let's then begin with verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love. That's kind of like compassion. This guy in charge, the prince of the eunuchs, he had some sympathy, compassion with Daniel. In verse 10, and the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat, or your food, your diet, and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort, your age? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. You know, if this prince of the eunuchs, if he violated the king's rules, what would happen to him? Well, they didn't have a executive branch and a legislative branch and a judicial branch. They didn't have any checks and balances on the king. Whatever the king said, you know, off with your head or whatever, that was okay. I mean, that's what happened. But he took a chance, and of course, you know, God is working this narrative, isn't he? God is in charge of this narrative, and things are going to work out as long as Daniel is faithful to his convictions, and the convictions are commensurate or rely on the law of Moses. Then things are going to work out. Verse 11, then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse, or King James center column reference here says beans. Anyway, it wasn't the fat meat, so to speak, of the Babylonians. And instead of wine, give them water to drink. And then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the counts of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So we had a little test there going on, a little pilot project, so to speak, and it ended well. Verse 14, so he consented to them in this matter, and tested them, or proved them, 10 days. Now that's not very long to get to move from maybe a haggard kind of appearance to a normal appearance, or a better appearance. But at the end of the 10 days, their countenances, and I suppose here is referring to just Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. At the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter. I sent a column in reference that says better looking. Do you have any? Does anyone have a New King James version, or
Better and fatter.
better and fatter? I guess fat was the premium in those days. That they had a little different, a little different values in terms of looks, I guess. Then Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse, beans, fruit. I don't know, it was probably fruit, some vegetables. I would guess it would be more than just beans. And as for, in verse 17, as for these 4 children, what about the New King James? Does it mention children or young men? The King James uses children in various ways, and it's for these young men, and certainly they may have been, they could have been in their teenage years. Now, that'd be pretty gutsy of them to, kind of challenge the foreign overseers. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge. Now, how this was given, whether it was a function of them being able to grasp things, that were being taught them in a natural, or it could have been somewhat beyond natural, that God was giving them assistance there. And for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all the learning and wisdom. I suppose that learning had to do with them discerning between, the customs of the culture and the history of the Babylonians compared to their own values, their own customs, their own. So I suppose these young men were able to discern, to think through, to figure out, to understand, and of course they would be learning some things that had not been learning back in their homeland before they were carried away into captivity. So as these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, possibly Daniel was the only one of the 4 that had, this capacity to interpret dreams and receive visions. Now, we don't know that, but it may have been that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, maybe they had some, dealings. We of course don't know much about what those other children, as the King James Version says, we don't know much about what they did. Now, I'm sure they didn't, in the 3-year period, and then in the future, prior to the time they were tossed into the furnace, I'm sure they didn't sit around picking their nose or whatever they might have done, in idle time. I would assume these people were busy. I'm just absolutely certain that they were involved, but we don't know what they were involved in. They might have been performing governmental functions all along. After their 3-year period, when the king determined that they were appropriate, fit for his government. Verse 18, now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Now, it's the day of reckoning. This is where the rubber met the road. Now, the king communed with them. Now, that word communed, is any other version you're using? Use it. Interviewed. So it was a discussion, but more probably a one-way. The king was in charge of asking the questions, so forth. And so the king interviewed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Or Daniel was Belshazzar at that point. Therefore stood they before the king. Now I wonder what that word stood meant. They stood. Therefore stood they before the king.
It says serve.
Served. They were, go get me a cup of coffee. Or go down here and check out what's going on down here in the street corner. Whatever the king wanted them to do. I don't know much about what kings did in those days, except we do know they were out and attacking. They were kind of like Putin. They were, out being aggressive and taking over other territory. Well, we don't know what they were doing, but they were serving the king, according to the book of Daniel. Then verse 20 of chapter 1, and in all matters of wisdom, now they look pretty good. In all matters of wisdom and understanding, that the king inquired of them. So that interview involved, did they know anything about the Egyptian culture? Did they know anything about government? What did they know? What could they do? Well, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. Now, I wonder why the Bible compares them to the astrologers. Now, I wonder how they were compared to their class of people, their group of people, their, I guess you'd say their classmates in this training program. I just wonder why they didn't compare Daniel and his colleagues to their class rather than the astrologers. These astrologers and magicians, they were Chaldeans, no doubt. They were advisors to the king. Kings in that period of time would cast lots to determine, whether they should go to battle or they should, which way they should go. There was always some, kind of mystic magic to their actions, and they had advisors that were really know-nothings as far as right and wrong, but they would at least convince the kings that they should do this or that. Well, the king found out that his advisors, his magicians, his group that he depended on, they weren't nearly as competent as these 4 Jewish young men. And Daniel continued even into the first year of Cyrus. So, 70 plus years. Of course, Darius the Mede was the first king of the Medo-Persian Empire, and then Cyrus. And so, you can imagine this. Daniel was taken captive there 70 years, served the entire time of the Babylonian Empire, and then saw at least least that first wave of captives going back to Jerusalem. That would have been really some, as we might say, that was quite a run, we might say today. That was quite an experience for him. So in chapter 2, continuing at the same narrative, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Now, it's common in the Old Testament era for, I guess, people to be dreaming dreams. And in the narrative, the Jewish history, what other godly young man helped a king out by interpreting a dream? Obviously, Joseph. And it's kind of interesting that God used this methodology to work His will on earth. You know, Joseph was placed. He was placed there not because he was a consummate politician and worked his way up, politically to that position of being second only to the Pharaoh. And the same is true here. Joseph was able to do something that nobody else could do in interpreting the dream. And of course, it was God's in giving him the interpretation. And the same is true here. So, Nebuchadnezzar was troubled by his dreams. And his sleep brake from him. What's that mean? Couldn't sleep. I don't know. They seem to have. Dreams seem to. We don't go around. I don't. Maybe politicians do. Maybe kings do. But go around and try to figure out their strategies based on dreams. Although I did know a lawmaker who was working on a formula for school funding, and he said he had a dream about how to fix it. So he was based on his dream. Now, I don't know. Do you get sermon ideas by dreaming? Not, probably not.
Dreams sometimes start to have sermons.
Now. Wow. But this was, he couldn't figure out what his dream. He couldn't figure out what the dream was, let alone the interpretation. Now that's an interesting. That's just an interesting situation. Interesting conundrum, you might say. That was a conundrum. 2, then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers. Now these were seasoned advisors. And of course, those kings, believing in multiple gods, probably figured that some of these people had some insights or some connection with these gods. And so they used them to make decisions with regard to, I'm sure, battle plans, with regard to which country to attack, which, what to do in various world affairs. And the Chaldeans, apparently the Chaldeans, the Babylonians and the Chaldeans are sometimes, it seems like they're used interchangeably, but probably the Chaldeans were a distinct group among the Babylonians. So they came and stood before the king, that is, all of these magicians and so on. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Didn't know it. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show ye the interpretation. Now that's a reasonable request, isn't it? That's, the king was like somebody approaching and say, what am I thinking? I don't know what you're thinking. You tell me what you're thinking. And these people they were magicians and so forth, but they weren't stupid. They said, well, tell us the dream and we'll interpret it. Well, that's a reasonable request. Then the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. I don't know. He's saying, that's your job. You tell me what you're supposed to know what I'm thinking. You're supposed to know what I'm dreaming. You have an important position here. You're supposed to know exactly what I'm thinking, what I'm dreaming. And they weren't getting anywhere. King answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If you will not make this known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made as a dunghill. That is, torn down, piled up, heaped up. Now, that was an unreasonable request of Nebuchadnezzar. But if you're the king in that era, you can make unreasonable requests and lop somebody's head off if they don't produce. But if ye show, and of course they're reasoning here now, but if ye show the dream and the interpretation thereof, ye shall receive me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. Now Joseph was rewarded handsomely, so to speak, by the king of Egypt, by the Pharaoh of Egypt, when he interpreted the dreams with regard to the 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty. Plenty and then the famine. Well, kings had everything at their disposal, so they could do what they want, and they could give what they want, they could withhold what they want. They answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it. Now, we're getting nowhere in this conversation, right? Absolutely nowhere. You show me the dream, you tell me the dream, we'll interpret it. Okay, you can't do it. You tell it to me, so back and forth. And the king answered and said, I know of certainty that ye would gain the time. Now, what's that? What do you think that means? Because ye see the thing is gone from me. What's that? Is there any other translation that uses some language other than gain the time? Pardon me?
I would say stall.
But is there another what? I think you're right. It's absolutely right. But what's the New King James Version? Or the ESV? Or
I know with certainty that you were trying to gain time.
gain time. Stalling. That's So, but if you do not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you. For ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation. Now, there must have been a lot of conversation. They must have had a lot of conversation that isn't recorded here, because how unreasonable is this? Tell me what I'm thinking, but I don't know what I'm thinking. So you tell me what I'm thinking, even though I don't know what I'm thinking. Now that's unreasonable, right?
Unless you had supernatural power, which is what they said they had.
Ned says, unless you had supernatural, and they were supposed to have supernatural power. They were supposed to be beyond the realm of rational human thinking. They were supposed to be getting messages, I suppose, from God, from their gods or whatever. Well, the Chaldeans, in verse 10, the Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there's not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore, there is no king, lord, nor ruler that ask such things at any magician or their astrologers or the Chaldeans. Now, these dudes they're what are they doing? They're challenging the king, right? Not a good idea. They're challenging the king. The king is, they're saying, essentially they're saying, you king, you're pretty stupid. I'm sure they were more smooth than that. But there's never been a situation. There's never been a situation where a king asked this sort of thing of his servants. Well, the king didn't take too kindly to that. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore, there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things or at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. King, that's unreasonable. And it is a rare thing that the king requireth. This is tantamount to saying, this is a bad request. This is not a reasonable request. And there's none other that can show it before the king, except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. Now, Ned mentioned, I think you mentioned this, that these people were supposed to be in touch with the gods, and so was the king unreasonable in terms of chopping their limbs off and so forth? Well, in today's culture, it would be absolutely unreasonable, but verse 12, for this cause the king was angry. Not only angry, but he was very furious, and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now, Daniel would have been considered a wise man, and the three Hebrew children, his companion, would have been considered to be, at least kind of an advisor to the king. And so the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And they sought Daniel. You suppose Daniel heard about this and was hiding out? Or he was about his business, whatever his business was? Probably, well, most assuredly, he was conducting his business. He wasn't on the run. He wasn't hiding out. In fact, there was no place to hide, right? I mean, he couldn't go back to Jerusalem. So he wouldn't have been, and of course his principles, his convictions, his manner of life, his attachment to God wouldn't have allowed him to be hiding out. But they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. Now, his fellows may have referred to the three companions, the Jewish companions, or may have referred to a whole cadre of people that were busy about government. I have never been in the White House, but some of you probably have. Or know people that have been in the White House, but there's, a lot of things going on in government. The president he's got a lot of people advising him or looking at this policy and that policy, this action and that action, and so you would imagine that kind of stuff going on. That a lot of different people, involved in a lot of different affairs. But the king is mad. Now that Daniel, they were looking for Daniel, and you can imagine big armed brute coming after Daniel with lots of weapons, and Daniel probably just nothing but his clothing. And does that mean something? Or is that somebody's phone? That's the bell. New kind of a bell. They don't ring the bell like that and have you stop preaching, do they?